I'm the only one. I'm the cheese standing alone. Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel, Read, Share, Repeat, where we talk about books from the perspective of an aspiring fantasy writer. Me, Kerry Share. He heard me talking and came out from wherever he was hiding and immediately decided to be disruptive. This is my very first video on the new channel, and I am so excited about it because today we are doing a 3x3x3 of books I plan to read in 2025. If you're new to my content and are not familiar with the concept of 3x3x3, basically what I do is I have 3 categories and 3 subcategories in each of those for a total of 27 of whatever the subject may be of the video. In this case, it's books. Now, 27 seems like a lot of books to take up a TBR in 2025, but all of these, I think you'll agree, deserve a chance in the new year. So the first category of this 3x3x3 is books that I own. I will be the first to say that I do need to do better at reading the books that I own. I do utilize my library a great deal, which is great and saves me a ton of money, but I have all of these books that I need to get through as well. And the first category of books that I own is books that I have owned the longest and still have not read. And the very oldest of those is Kushiel's Dart by Jacqueline Carey. I have attempted to read this probably 3 times, and each time I was intimidated by the length. This baby is almost 700 pages, even in this edition. But I've enjoyed the writing every single time and the story, so there really isn't any other reason for me to avoid it other than its length. And I've decided 2025 is the year that I slay this dragon. This is a story of political maneuvering and wheeling and dealing told through the eyes of someone in the sex trade. This book is almost 25 years old, and it's really about time that I stop avoiding it. Next up in this category is The Wolf of Oren Yarrow by K.S. Veloso. And I'm going to be upfront with you, I know almost nothing about this book other than the series title is Chronicles of the Bitch Queen, and hello, I'm here for that. This is one of those ebooks that was on sale and came into my inbox as a promotional deal from either BookBub or Amazon or somewhere, and it was 99 cents, and I said, yes, please. So while I don't know much about it, this is another book that has just been on my TBR for way too long, and it's time that I finally tackle it. The third and final book in this subcategory is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. And again, this is another book that I don't know much about. I believe it is a political inspired fantasy, or maybe there's something to do with the empire being in turmoil. I'm not super sure. I do know it is another chonker and has a lot of positive hype around it. However, its length just seems to intimidate people. But it is, again, one of the books I've had on my TBR the longest, and I want to see what all the buzz is about. So this will be something I'm actually planning on tackling pretty early in 2025. The second subcategory of books that I own are series continuations. And for this subcategory, I'm specifically trying to focus on books that will finish out series, because last year, just to give you a preview of another video I have coming up later this month, I started a whole bunch of new series in addition to the ones that I started in 2023, and I only completed one. So I'm gonna try and focus this year on finishing a lot of these series, starting with the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence, the third of which is called Holy Sister. I have talked a little bit about how Red Sister, the first entry of the series, changed my brain chemistry when I first read it in 2018 or 19. I absolutely loved that book so much. It meant so much to me, and it really did kind of change my perspective. The way I always describe the Book of the Ancestor series is it is a book about nun assassins in a science fantasy setting with an almost exclusively female cast, but the main theme is friendship between girls. And that particular theme is something I have learned I really, really love, especially when the main character is someone who has been ostracized from society, or is considered to be dangerous, or is excluded, or is kind of prickly for whatever reason, and discovers that she can have friends and how much friendship does mean to her, and is softened because of that. That is something that I have learned I really, really love, and it is a key feature of the Book of of the Ancestor series. I think it is time that I finally cap off this trilogy, the first of which did impact my life several years ago. Next up in my series continuations is The Golden Enclaves by Naomi Novik, and this is another book featuring another young woman who discovers the power of friendship. I read A Deadly Education earlier this year, and to my great surprise, I actually really liked it. I am typically not a big YA fan, and I had heard that this book wouldn't exactly be to my taste, and the opposite was true. I actually ended up really liking it. That being said, I am still working my way through the sequel, The Last Graduate. Nothing against the book itself. I have just been kind of slumping over the last 3 months, really. That being said, finishing out The Last Graduate is a top priority for me in these last few days of the year, trying to finish that out. I'm already halfway done with it. I just need to sit down and focus. So I am positive that I'm going to get that done, which means I will be able to finally pick up The Golden Enclaves and finish out this series, which has been such a huge surprise. And lastly, in this series continuation subcategory, I have What the Library Hides by Isabella Banez. This was another surprising read for me because I liked it so much and because of the reasons that I liked it. What the River Knows is the first entry of this duology, and it is about a woman whose parents go away on an expedition to Egypt. She gets words after several months that they have passed away, and she decides to go to Egypt herself and find out the truth of her parents' deaths. It had its issues, it wasn't perfect, but I was so excited about the book that I immediately bought it because I had gotten it from the library and pre-ordered the sequel. I am planning on rereading What the River Knows before I get to this one so that I can annotate it as part of my annotating my entire physical library, but once I do reread it and get it annotated, this will be my top priority. And speaking of rereads, that is actually my next subcategory, rereads. Because of my annotation project in which I want to literally annotate every single physical book that I own, there are quite a few books that I need to go back and reread. Some of which I had already tagged to reread because it had been so long since I first picked them up and I now want to continue the series. Case in point would be Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This is another book I read back in like 2018 or 19 and again, really loved. It's been the only book that I can remember since I was a kid actually making me cry. And I remember at the time that I read it, I wanted to write a book like it. I really loved it and it really meant a lot to me. That being said, I never got around to continuing the series. Even before starting my annotation project, I had this book tagged to reread because it has just been so long since I read it. And I do want to start working my way through the Robin Hobb universe. Next up in this rereads category, I have The Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson. And this book, I can't remember when I read it, but it has been probably between 3 and 5 years, but it came as kind of a surprise to me that I enjoyed it so much. There were some elements that I thought were undercooked and a little bit goofy. The main character's name, for example, is Kelsey, but it's spelled Kelsea. So there is a little bit of goofiness to this book, but I actually ended up liking it. I love books with female characters who are not competent, but their tenacity or their kind personality garners them allies to help them through, or just their specialized skills ends up winning the day. And this kind of fits that mold. So while it's not perfect, I do remember my time with this book fondly, and I'm looking forward to rereading it so I can finish the series. And lastly in this rereads category is The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. And the reason I want to reread this is because my experience reading it was a little bit disjointed. I first picked it up on audio after it came out, and it took me like 2 months to get through it because I just don't enjoy listening to audiobooks as much as I do physically reading. And then I discovered that I had actually also bought the ebook when it came out, so I had both. And so when I got to the climax and I just wanted to binge my way through the end of the book, I just read it on ebook. And I really liked it. The ending was so good. There was an end reveal in this book that was so good and got me really excited about the rest of the series. And now that the third and final book has just recently come out, I think that I have got to get back into this and finish reading the series. And I've also got it physically, which means it'll be part of my annotation project. So those are the 9 books in the books that I own category that I want to read in 2025. My next category fittingly, is books that I don't own. And the first subcategory in books that I don't own is anticipated releases, which explains why I do not own them. And typically I am not a person who looks ahead to see what's being released because I have such a huge backlog of books that I do need to read. But in this case, there are a couple of sequels and series enders that I cannot wait for. The first being The Ashfire King by Chelsea Abdullah, the follow-up to The Stardust Thief, which was the first entry of her Sansi trilogy, and that was my favorite book of 2023. I really, 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 really liked it. I'm a person who really enjoys Middle Eastern inspired fantasy, so I loved the setting, 1001 Arabian Nights inspiration. I love the relationship between the two main characters so much. As soon as I finished, I was so upset that I had to wait a year for the follow-up, and then it turned out that it wasn't coming out this year in 2024. I have to wait till 2025, and it has been a long drought. Next up in this anticipated release category is A Drop of Corruption by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the second book in the Shadow of the Leviathan series, the first of which being A Tainted Cup, which I really, really, really loved. This is a book that I would describe as being a Holmes and Watson style murder mystery in an Attack on Titan-like setting with a plant-based magic system and a queer romantic subplot. And I have said it numerous times and I'll say it again, if those buzzwords don't get you to read this book, our tastes will not align. Robert Jackson Bennett rocketed pretty close to the top of my favorite authors list with just 2 books, The Tainted Cup and Foundry Side, both of which I loved. So suffice it to say, I'm looking forward to picking up the second book in this series pretty quickly when it comes out. And lastly, in my anticipated release category is Faithbreaker by Hannah Kaner. And I have talked a lot about this series this year because I read both Godkiller and Sunbringer pretty close together after Sunbringer came out. I liked Godkiller. I had a lot of positive things to say about it, but there were certain things that held me back from giving it the 5-star, and those things were not an issue at all in Sunbringer, and it was my first 5-star read in several years. If you're not familiar with my content, I am very stingy with those 5 stars, so I was so excited to finally hit on a book that made me so like just excited. I will not be waiting on Faithbreaker. I will be reading it almost instantly after I get it in my hands. The next subcategory of books that I don't own are books I intend to check out from the library to see if I like them. I utilize my library a lot. I try to maintain a 50-50 mix of library and my owned TBR. And these 3 books are books that I have been keeping my eye on at the library, and either I'm on the hold list or I plan to check it out sometime over the course of 2025. The first of which being Malice by John Gwynne. I already know that I really liked the first book in the Bloodsworn saga, The Shadow of the Gods, which I mentioned earlier, but I'm not for sure if his writing style is completely for me or if it was just that one book. So before I commit to physically purchasing any more books by this author, I decided I would go ahead and check out another one of his series. I've heard some great things about whatever the series title is that Malice starts, so I think that would be a good way to gauge whether or not John Gwynne will become an auto-buy author for me. Next up in this category is Blood Over Bright Haven by M.L. Wang. I heard a lot of really great things about M.L. Wang's first release, The Sword of Kaigen. I had it on Kindle Unlimited with the intention of reading it, and I just never got around to it before I canceled my Kindle Unlimited subscription. But I know that M.L. Wang has really found success in the indie publishing space. There's been a lot of hype around this most recent release, and while my preference would be to read The Sword of Kaigen first, I think I'm going to go ahead and get on this holds list pretty soon. And lastly, in this library checkout category is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I have not read a Brando Sando book. I started Tress and the Emerald Sea last year and ended up softy and effing it for a number of reasons. And over the course of this year, I have decided I would really like to go back and start at the beginning with Brandon Sanderson. I know not every book that he writes is part of the Cosmere, but when someone has a huge backlist like Brandon Sanderson does, something in me just wants to go back and start from the very beginning so I can watch the evolution of the writing. writing. And I also don't want to miss any of the larger connections of the books that are part of the Cosmere. And I don't really care if there's a preferred reading order. I don't really care if I won't miss anything from reading the first couple of books. This is just how I prefer to do it. I want to watch the progression, and I want to enjoy it in the same way that day one fans did, in publication order. Now, that being said, I do know that earlier books in an author's backlist tend to be the weakest, so I'm not going to judge as harshly as I would probably later books. Don't worry about that. But I am going to start with the beginning. The third and final subcategory of books I don't own is my top priority ISOs, or in search of. These are books that I have been looking for to buy physically, but have not come across for whatever reason. I'm looking for them when I go into a bookstore. The first book in this category is The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker. I read this several years ago, and there's a reveal within the first chapter that was so good. And I know it's kind of funny to say a reveal at the beginning of the book, but if you've read it, you know. But the reveal at the beginning of this book was so good that I was instantly hooked regardless of what the story was. And I didn't end up liking the story. It is a kind of unique seafaring story where there are two warring nations in this sort of archipelago. And in order to get an upper hand, they have both decided to make their ships out of the bones of these sort of sea dragons. However, they have since pretty much been hunted to extinction. And so now these bone ships are just sort of piecemealed back together, but they are very unique, very powerful ships. When the first sea dragon in many, many, many years is sighted, the race is on to be the first to claim its bones. I loved a lot about this story, about this book, and I have been wanting to continue with the series, but with my decision to annotate, I do want this book to be something that I own physically and can annotate. Unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to exist anywhere, at least not in my metro area on the shelves. I've even been to a couple of different Barnes and Nobles and didn't see it. So this may end up being a book that I just bite the bullet on and just buy it online somewhere. Next on this list is Mirrored Heavens by Rebecca Roanhorse, and this book isn't that hard to find physically. The problem is finding the rest of the series physically. Earlier this year, I went to Barnes & Noble shortly after this book came out with the intention of buying the entire series, and Barnes & Noble had the first two books, Black Sun and Fevered Star, in softcover, and Mirrored Heavens in hardcover, and that was it. And I was like, I want them to match. Fortunately, right at the end of this year, I went to Half Price Books to get a gift card for my daughter's stocking, and I just happened to wander over to the sci-fi fantasy section, and lo and behold, I found it. So now I'm on the hunt for Fevered Star. I might go online and get this one. When I looked online for the hardcover of this book, it was like almost $50. I'm hoping Fevered Star is not quite that expensive, but my goal is to complete this series in hardcover now that I've got one. I would have been happy with softcover, but when I found this, I was like, okay, this is what we're doing. While I have heard that the third and final book has some issues with pacing, I'm still really looking forward to seeing what happens with my favorite characters and finally knowing how it all shakes out. I just have to get the physical copies first. So that is it for books that I do not own. My third and final category of this 3x3x3 is books that for whatever reason I have been putting off. The first subcategory of books I've been putting off is the hype train. These are books that I want to read, but I'm afraid of how much I'll love them. The first being Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, and this is a little bit of a cheat because I actually did start reading this book last year. However, I was kind of in the middle of a reading slump and didn't feel up to picking up a physical book, and eventually I decided that I was going to put it down and restart it when I was in a better headspace to read, because I do know that something about this book that a lot of people have said is that it really doesn't hold your hand and it can be kind of confusing. So I didn't want to read part of it and then come back to it months later and not understand it and maybe have a negative experience that way. So I soft DNF'd it. The portion I did read, I did really like. So I know that I'm going to like this book. I know that this is a series that has a lot of positive hype around it. I know that the fourth and I think, final book of the quartet still has yet to come out, and that a lot of people are pretty ravenous for it. This is going to be the year that I finally tackle Gideon the Ninth in its entirety, and I am absolutely certain that I am going to love it. Next up in this hype train subcategory is The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence. Mark Lawrence wrote the Book of the Ancestor series, which I mentioned earlier. When The Book That Wouldn't Burn came out, I immediately pre-ordered it. Mark Lawrence's writing is for me. I have since read the sequel to Red Sister and the beginning of another series by this author, and I know for sure that Mark Lawrence's writing is for me. And I think some of the components of this book, a endless library, a mystery, two characters from different worlds coming together, I think a lot of these components are really going to appeal to me. I have zero excuses for why I haven't read it. I keep saying it's just not the right moment. I will know when it's time, and that moment hasn't come, but I'm gonna stop making excuses and I'm gonna get to this book this year. And finally in this category is Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This is another book that could have gone in my oldest own TBR category at the beginning, because I've had this book for a while and I don't know that much about it, but a couple of booktubers that I follow read it this year and said some pretty positive things. And so I know that it is pretty unique in the magic or the world or something. And I don't know, it just sounded really, really good. I started getting super hyped for it, and just the more and more I heard about it, I was like, oh no, my expectations might be too high. I'm a little nervous that I may have gotten too much into my head about it, but I'm gonna get into this series this year. The next subcategory for books I've been putting off is books I'm afraid I won't like, and that's the reason I haven't read them. And this first one is probably gonna get me in trouble, but that is The Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. And look, I have said numerous times on this channel that I thought Six of Crows was fine, and I think by and large it was fine, but when it sits in my memory, it sits in a pretty negative space. I think if I read and reviewed it today, I would probably give it a lower rating, and the only reason I gave it the 3 that I did is because I know how beloved it is. The vast majority of that book had tropes and writing styles that specifically I do not like. And the ending I just felt really shitty about, but it hooked me because Inej was my favorite character. Because of that, and the fact that it's only a duology, I committed to reading the second book. But I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't think that I'll like it because I really didn't care for the first one in almost every respect. And I know that's an unpopular opinion on the internet. I gotta speak my truth. I didn't like it. The next book in this slightly spicy category is The King of Fairy by A.J. Lancaster, and this is the 4th and final book in the Starial Quartet, which I really enjoyed the first one when I read it in 2023. It kind of took me by surprise. I picked it up on a whim on audio and it ended up being just exactly what I needed in that moment. And each book I have liked subsequently less and less. And then the third book ended on a trope that I really hate. And I won't spoil it, but it really disappointed me. But that being said, I'm 3 books into a quartet. Can I really just not finish? My neuroses says no, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish this series. I own all 4 of them on audio, so the last will be on audio, and I tend to take those really, really slowly, so who knows how long it'll take me to get to this, but I'm gonna finish it, and just so I can mark a series off of my list saying that I completed it. But man, that ending to the 3rd book was disappointing to say the least. And the last book in this category is The Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi, and this is another book that I'm kind of cheating at because I did read part of it late last year or early this year, and the reason I'm afraid I won't like this is from what I did read, I didn't really like the writing style that much. The writing style was very telly, very, very explainy and not very showy, and that was kind of grating. I don't know if it gets better after the first 20%. That was what kind of killed the vibe for me. Now, to be fair, it was late in the year. I was crunching, trying to get my new content schedule in place and everything to do with Christmas and the holidays. So it wasn't entirely the writing style, and I knew that I did want to get back to it. Again, I love Middle Eastern inspired fantasy. This book should appeal to me if I can just get over that writing style, or at least the portion of the book where it does a lot of telling and not a lot of showing. We are almost to the end of the line here. We are almost finished. The last subcategory of books that I've been putting off reading is books that I am intimidated by. The first one in this category is Abaddon's Gate by James S.A. Corey. This is the third book in the Expanse series, the first of which was Leviathan's Gate, which I read earlier this year, and followed that up with the second one, which was Caliban's War. And the reason I'm intimidated by this is because of my annotation project. I have to go back and now read the first two. And I didn't love the first one. I liked the setting and I liked the story. I hated the characters, the two main characters, hated them both. While that does get better in the sequel, I don't know if I am excited about rereading Leviathan Wakes. Maybe I will just exempt this series from the annotation project. They're also all very long. This one's over 500 pages. But I really want to watch the show. I really want to watch it with my partner, but I do not want to be spoiled. So I got to read them first. So I'm going to sit on it and maybe I just won't annotate these books. Next up in this category is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. If you have been following me over on my other channel for a while now, you may know that I have tried to read The Blade Itself a couple of times this year on audio, and both times has been a dismal failure. Partially because of the format. I struggle with audio, partially because of reading slumps, and partially because I'm worried that Joe Abercrombie isn't going to be to my taste. I have always said that I do not like to be depressed in my spare time, and so I don't like to read books where everything is just bleak and everyone is horrible to each other. And I have heard that that's kind of Joe Abercrombie's bag. So this one has been one I have been struggling with. I feel like Joe Abercrombie is too big in the genre to ignore, even if he ends up not being to my taste. So I do feel like I should at least try. But I am starting to think that the audiobook is not going to be the best way for me to tackle this book. I think what I need to do is go back to my library and check it out and read it that way, because something about, I like the audiobook. The narrator is really good, but I think that if I'm going to get through this book, I need to get through it expeditiously, and on audio is just not the way to go. And my 2 attempts, I think, bears that out. But I am going to try it, and at least then I will know for sure if I do like his writing style or the style of his stories or not. And finally, the last book on this list is The Will of the Many by James Islington. And I am intimidated by this because of the hype, because of the length, because of the plot inputs I'm afraid that I won't like. There's just a lot going against this particular book, but I also don't want to miss out. And then I made probably the mistake of buying this really, really beautiful new edition that came out recently. So now I kind of have to. So many people were into this book this year, and I just feel like I'm afraid that I'm not going to like it, and then I will be, it's just like how I feel with Six of Crows, where like I'm the only one. I'm the cheese standing alone. But again, I don't want to miss out, and it could be awesome. I may love it, but I won't know until I try it. So I've got to at least try it. And that wraps up this 3x3x3. 27 books on my TBR in 2025. That is a shit ton, considering I only read 55 books last year to completion, 65 if you count the DNFs. So if I read 60 books next year, this is almost half of my TBR. Do I expect to get to all of them? Probably not, but I feel like these books deserve a shot in 2025. Thank you so much for watching. I so appreciate it. If you like my content and want to support the channel, please like and subscribe. And if you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me a book stack emoji. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is my very first video on this new channel. It would go a long way to boosting this channel in the algorithm and helping me reach more viewers if you like and subscribe and comment. So I would so appreciate it. In my next video, I will be doing a cozy reset, the first of the new year. I'm going to reflect a little bit on 2024. I'm going to do some tidying up. I've got to get that tree out of here. And I will be talking a little bit about my very first TBR of the new year. So I hope you look forward to it, and I will see you then. Bye.